In the scientific laboratory, Dr. Frank is developing synthetic skin. At this time Charlie, his colleague, approaches him to discuss their current project. During a conversation Charlie asks, "Have you been out often lately?" Dr. Frank answers negatively, explaining the lack of communication with colleagues with his difficult work. Charlie, understanding his dedication to the work, he says, "I know you have been busy, but a new woman has just joined our team. Maybe you should meet her." It turns out that Dr. Frank is disabled and uses a wheelchair. Soon a beautiful girl comes and Charlie introduces her to Dr. Frank. The girl's name is Valerie and she compliments Dr. Frank, calling him cute. Taken by surprise, Frank sheepishly takes it for a joke. However, Valerie does not understand the man's humor. He apologizes and politely asks to be left alone. Frank turns to Charlie, expressing his bewilderment about this stunningly beautiful girl, and Charlie explains that he himself is not suitable for the prototype they are testing. Then Charlie brings Frank to the room where the prototype is located. Valerie turns out to be there, who says that she shares the scientist's love for opera. The two have a nice conversation and the girl expresses her desire to spend time together. It turns out that the scientists have just worked on her electronic brain and she essentially the robot. Dr. Frank leaves the room, clearly upset and annoyed. He does not see the need to work to solve his personal problems, where Charlie tries to calm him down by reminding him of their long-standing relationship and explaining that this is just testing the robot before its mass production. Robots are created so that they became companions and an assistant to the men, and the company management decided to keep this project a secret for now. The Frenchman sharply replies that he does and need a robot, but a person who can understand and empathize with him, someone with a sense of humor, and does everything possible to convince his colleague of his characteristics and emotions. However, this is not convinces Frank. The next day Frank attends a psychotherapy session. Rachel has been a therapist for 5 years. When she helps a man sit up, he curiously asks what she thinks about her patients, but she politely refuses to answer. The next morning Frank arrives at work where he meets Charlie and the other ago and asks, have they found anyone to test the prototype knife? No one matches the profile. Then Frank suddenly says that he has changed his mind and is ready to try before he takes the robot home. The board of directors gives him a brief description of the prototype and the procedure they carry out every morning at 9 a.m. They also provide Frank with a remote control in case an emergency arises that requires the robot to be turned off or her memory erased. During dinner that evening, Valerie tries to start conversations and even jokes, but calls her just a robot and a dishwasher. The offended girl gets up from the table to wash the dishes and tears flow down her face. Seeing that Valerie is upset, the man apologizes and tries to console her by wiping her tears, but soon wonders why he is apologizing to the robot and worried about her feelings. The next morning when the scientist is asked about his relationship with Valerie, Frank compares her to a car that is only needed to make life easier. The next day, during a therapy session with Rachel, Frank asks the philosophical question of what life really is. Can a car be considered alive? To which Rachel replies that something can be considered alive if it experiences the fear of death. Later that evening, while watching a movie at home, Valerie asks Frank if he has ever been in love, and Frank admits that he was once in love before the accident that left him disabled. Valerie asks about the accident and learns that it was caused by a drunk driver. When they return to the cinema, Valerie sees the kissing scene and asks Frank to kiss her. Also gently taken aback, Frank mutters that he didn't think she was capable of this, but Valerie surprises the man passionately kissing him. Panicked SOBR, the girl is upset, believing that the man didn't like the kiss. Frank replies that he is I was surprised because I felt her lips and saliva as if she were a person, and Valerie explains that her saliva contains the same components as humans but without bacteria. Valerie undresses to show that her body is exactly the same as that of an ordinary woman and looks like she feels the same thing. They have a wonderful morning, but Valerie kisses Frank and helps him into the car, wishing him a good day. During a therapy session, Rachel is late and Frank asks why she was wearing sunglasses indoors. When the woman takes off her glasses, Frank sees the bruises under her eyes. Rachel says that she accidentally fell, but Frank realizes that she is lying. When she returns home, Valerie meets Frank, calls him my darling, tries to kiss, however Frank rejects her advances and asks her to refrain from such displays of affection, and also explains that the events of the previous night were a mistake, reminding her that she is just a machine. Despite his arguments, Valerie confesses that after last night she already had feelings for him, but at that moment the phone rings. It's Rachel, who asks Frank to meet her. Frank agrees and soon the two meet in a bar, not realizing that Valerie is watching them from the side. Ray asks about the woman who answered the phone, to which F replies that it is his friend Rachel, who hints that he seems to have changed his mind about some important agreement they had. But Frank calmly denies this. After hearing the couple's conversation, Valerie angrily breaks the window glass. The next morning, as Frank is about to leave, Valerie reminds him of his promise to spend time together, but Frank explains that he said maybe and that he plans to spend the day outdoors, something he hasn't done for a long time. The man refuses her company and also the cookies she offers him. PRK meets Rachel, who helps him climb a rock, an activity he really loved before the accident. Valerie again watches the couple, who, having climbed onto a rock, have a sweet conversation with each other. Frank thanks Rachel for her support, for helping him feel whole, strong and loved. He also mentions that she is not like other women, but VNO cooks are sewn by her husband poorly. Frank does and know what to answer, and Rachel is interested in who she is. Valeria introduces herself as the companion and partner with whom Frank lies and asks if the scientist was talking about her. Rachel does and understand what's going on, and Frank admits that Valerie has actually been living in his house for some time and tries to justify that this is due to his job. Feeling betrayed by his lies, Rachel decides to leave, and when Frank begs her to stay, Valerie, driven by jealousy, asks why he chose Rachel over her. Frank explains that Rachel is a living person and Valerie is just a robot. Suddenly Valerie rushes at Rachel with intent, pushes her off a cliff, but at the very last moment Frank manages to activate the remote control and stop Valerie. The next morning in the office, while working on synthetic skin, Charlie apologizes for the incident, and when Frank asks about Valerie's condition, Charlie tells him that they are going to clear her memory and reboot the robot. Frank is saddened to equate this process with the murder of Valerie. However, Charlie reminds him of the danger that she posed and comes to the conclusion that it is necessary to restore her from scratch, including her mind and memory. Frank asks to see Valerie one last time before her memory is erased and activates it without permission. Robot. When Valerie turns on, Frank persuades his colleague to leave him alone with the robot. When Charlie leaves, Frank admits that he really missed Valerie. Then the scientist asks if she is afraid of dying and turning into nothing. The girl answers no, which upsets Frank. After all, he has already begun to perceive her almost as a person. At the same time, the scientist understands that the robot in its current state poses a danger to people. At night, when Frank is about to go home, Valerie suddenly opens her eyes because the scientist forgot to turn it off. The girl breaks down the door and runs away from the laboratory, and PRK, meanwhile, get into her Masha, not suspecting that Valerie climbed onto the roof of the car. Frank arrives at Rachel's house to apologize. The woman lets the guest into the house, where they remember the strange events of the day. The two joke about whether the woman has prepared dinner for him when suddenly a loud crash is heard from above. Frank persuades Rachel to call the police, but she calms him down and decides to find out the cause of the noise herself by checking every room. The woman finds nothing. Suddenly Valerie appears, scaring the woman. Rachel tries to call Frank, but Valerie attacks her, and Frank appears and sees Valerie strangling Rachel. He tries to intervene, but the robot throws him against the wall. Frank can find the remote control, controls the robot, and remembers that a powerful discharge of electric current can disable her. By grabbing the electrical cable, Frank screams that his back hurts and calls for help from Valerie. The robot rushes to the aid of the man, but in the last minutes of Valerie's life he admits that she is very afraid of death. In the final scene, Frank and Rachel hug tightly, and the voiceover says that technologies designed to make our lives easier can be extremely dangerous. Music.